Dr. Andrews, welcome, and thank you. It is my great pleasure to just say a few words of welcome to put in the context with Catherine Kelleher's passing, this great series that we run and in her honor. I wanted to just say a few words about Catherine's imprint on our DNA. Our DNA as a school, our DNA as CISM, our DNA as scholars and practitioners of policy. For those of you who did not have the pleasure to know Catherine, she was truly a force of nature, but I think it's important that we all understand the legacy that we're inheriting from her. So I've chosen just 6 elements of her that I directly see her DNA imprinted on us. Catherine was a founder and a builder par excellence. She was one of the founding 4 faculty members of this school. She was the founding director, or she liked to call it the founding mother of CISM, our host today. And she was the creator and first founding president of Women in International Security. All 3 of these institutions have not only thrived, they've thrived because of what she created and how she created it and who she attracted to it. Nancy Gallagher, who will be here shortly, is in a meeting, which is also probably part of the DNA that Catherine left behind. There are always things for the CISM director to be doing. Nancy has called Catherine the quintessential scholar practitioner, and I have long been proud of this institution as a home for not only scholar practitioners, but practitioner scholars. And I actually met Catherine, and I thought she was a practitioner scholar. In fact, I think she was both. She took it both directions, from scholar to practitioner and back again. A second piece of the DNA she left us is the deep commitment to interdisciplinary education. She was trained as a political scientist, but you wouldn't have known it to hear her discuss policy. She could have been an economist. She could have been a psychologist. She could have been many, many disciplines. And that interdisciplinary DNA, Nancy, there's a chair for you. So I think that is a second imprint on our DNA. A third is the international quality of this education and of this school. Most don't know it, but the vast majority of policy schools in the United States and internationally are not actually both domestic and international policy. In fact, we are one of about 16% of policy schools that do both. That is directly attributable to Catherine Kelleher. And it's a proud 16%, and that's the way the world's gone. So it's leaving other policy schools to catch up, but that's just a shameless plug. Another quality of the DNA that Catherine left us is that she left a place and a big space for women at the table. I'm looking at this audience, over 50% women. She was one of 4 of the initial faculty, but throughout her life on faculties here and elsewhere, she was one of a tiny minority. Today, 50% of our full-time faculty at this institution are women. That's Catherine's influence across the years, across the decades. She was also very much a rigorous teacher, but she was equally, if not more, a rigorous mentor. Catherine mentored everyone she taught. It was personal, it was professional, it was just who she was. I would like to think that's who we are as a school, thanks to Catherine. Finally, Catherine as a leader. this is a school that aspires to create leaders, not just scholars, not just thinkers, not just doers, not just bureaucrats, but leaders. And Catherine had a very distinctive leadership style. She not only brought the, classic leadership traits, let's call them masculine leadership traits, to the job, but she took her job as founding mother very seriously. She brought warmth to the role of a leader. And that's something that was the first thing that hit me when I met her. I was a graduate student working at the Brookings Institution, and this amazing woman came in, spoke with all of us junior nobodies, and I felt the warmth from the day I met her. That was true throughout her life. So all of these traits that I consider to be part of the best part of our DNA as a school, Catherine, I think, is our founding mother in that sense as well. So, no pressure or anything, but your talk today is building on some very big shoulders, as you know.
I'm well aware.
But I just wanted to note that we have, in Catherine's legacy, I just saw Mac Dessler come in, and Nancy Gallagher came in. Our SISM directors that followed Catherine are also part of her legacy. So, welcome back, Mac. It's great to see you. And Nancy, I gave excuses that you were off doing SISM business. So,
talking to our Carnegie program officer, which is extremely important, yes.
The job of a SISM director is never done. But thank you for coming, Dr. Andrews. And I think, Nancy, did you want to say something before we start?
Well, I've already said a lot about Catherine in the piece that I wrote, and I know that a number of you have contributed to that, and I encourage you to all add your thoughts and reflections. I've been really struck by, there's obviously nothing good at all without losing somebody who's very important to you, but Catherine always did manage to find something positive about even the most difficult circumstances. And I would say that the positive thing for me has been reconnecting with people, both people that I knew before, but had lost touch with, or people that I'd never known directly, but I'd heard about them through Catherine, and then when Catherine passed away, they got in touch with me. And hearing stories about her, it's very, very obviously inspirational. But one thing that somebody said that particularly stood out in my mind, and he talked about Catherine as the sort of happy warrior persona, right? Which is very, very much her public persona. But he also talked about how she had a different side to her that many people saw in private, and that side was somebody who was creative, somebody who was diplomatic, somebody who was compassionate, somebody who, I can't count the number of people who have told me, Catherine did something for me at a time when I had something really difficult happening in my life. She did something for me that was really meaningful, but she didn't draw attention to it, right? And that, to me, is at least as important a quality for leadership as anything that's visibly seen outside or anything that you get credit for. So, thank you everybody for coming today. I'm delighted to have Alina Andrews here as talking about Valiant Women. I think that that's a perfect label for Catherine, and a perfect label for what we all aspire to be, those of us who are women and those of us who are not. Right? You can still aspire to be valiant. Amen. Alina Andrews is the author of Valiant Women. She received her PhD in political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, as did Catherine. So this is yet another connection there. She spent over a decade working in foreign policy and national security, previously at RAND and the U.S. Institute of Peace. Numerous connections to people in the room who have done those kinds of things as well. She's particularly committed to bridging the gap between academia, policy, and the broader public, and has participated in several initiatives to that goal. So I can't think of anybody better to represent the kind of next generation of people trying to carry on Catherine's legacy. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dinor and Dr. Gallagher. It was already a privilege to be asked to come here and give this talk a couple weeks ago before Dr. Kelleher's passing. It seems like it's taken on even more significance now. Just before I begin, I think like so many people in this room, you know, her vision for the field has really been one that I've shared and has been axiomatic for me. And I think it's worth reiterating that this is a field, I think security studies and international relations can be a field where we value interdisciplinarity, where we bridge the gap and talk to policymakers and especially the public even, maybe once or twice. And you know, for me in particular, this project and also just the life that I've lived, I think it's also a place where we can value and appreciate new and diverse perspectives. And that's what we'll be talking a little bit about today. So I hope that in the conversation we have, and particularly in the Q&A, that's a reminder of the importance of these values and of Dr. Kelleher's vision. And I would also just be remiss if in a conversation about women who led the way in national security, I didn't say that, if I didn't say that I would not be standing here if not for women like Dr. Kelleher in particular. As Dr. Gallagher just mentioned, she graduated from MIT in the late 60s, which I guarantee you was a very different place than the MIT that I arrived at several years ago. I'm sure she had to hack her way through a bit of a jungle, and I'm grateful that she did because she left a path for women like me. And when I arrived there, you know, trying to, a young civilian woman of color who knew nothing about the military and said, "Teach me something, please." I think fewer eyebrows were raised because women like Dr. Kelleher had come and done not just security, but hard security, you know, nukes, the really meat and potatoes of what we do. And she had done it well. And so for that, I am eternally grateful. I'm delighted to be here. And I hope that we can enjoy ourselves today in the house that Dr. Kelleher built. And I hope wherever she is, she enjoys it too. So, okay, let's talk about the book. I'm just going to take my watch here, so we have plenty of time for discussion. And here we go. This is the book. This is the hard-fought cover. For those of you who are, if anyone wants to know about trade publishing, I'm your girl, we can talk about it. But this is the 17 millionth iteration of the cover. And for those of you who are wondering how Valiant Women came about, it is actually from a quote by Harry Truman. It's inscribed on the World War II memorial, in which he says, right at the sort of close to the end of World War II, "Our debt to the heroic men and valiant women in the service of our country can never be repaid. They have earned our undying gratitude. America will never forget their sacrifices." And the book and the title is very much a rejoinder to that statement. I think we've done a very good and impressive job of honoring our heroic men. I think we could probably do a better job of honoring our valiant women, and that is essentially what this book aims to do. And before I begin, I just want to make note of one caveat, which is that this is not an academic book. It's published by a trade press, so it's Mariner Press, which is a subset of HarperCollins. And it's intended for a wide audience, and I'll talk about why that's the case a little bit later. We can talk about that in the Q&A too. But I'll say this. I'm a trained political scientist, much like Dr. Kelleher, and I was I herald from the school of what I like to call the Barry Posen School of Hard Knocks, which is my advisor at MIT. Those of you who know him will understand that reference. Which means that everything I do, everything I think, every thought that flits through my mind, whether or not I want it to, is rooted in theory, is rooted in literature, is rooted in something academic. And this book is no exception. So while the book itself is written very much as a story, it is rooted in an academic literature and an academic debate. It's a product of that, and it engages with it. And I hope for those of you that read it, although it won't be sort of hammering it over your head, you'll see that. And that's what I hope to talk about a little bit today, given that I have the pleasure of being here. So given that, the rest of the talk will proceed in two parts. The first half is going to be a review of sort of what the literature is, what the debate is that I'm engaging with. And then the second half will turn toward what in a traditional academic talk I would call field work and case studies, which is really just an opportunity for me to tell you about some amazing 100-year-old women. who I got the opportunity to talk to and, you know, in some cases, many times, on many occasions, be berated by, things like that. So there's nothing like it. I highly recommend. And some of it's on video, so it's not here, but I'm happy to share it with those who are interested. Okay, but let's talk a little bit about the theory, right? What am I actually talking about? What am I doing here? So, the debate, why the Allies won World War II. It's a big debate, spoiler alert. For those of you who know something about World War II or care about World War II or find yourself among the poor souls like me who've spent their entire career thinking about World War II, this is the vexing question of our field, which is essentially what is it that got the Allies to the victory line before the Axis? And it has about 1 million different answers. Some folks think it's leadership, some folks think it's doctrine, other folks think it's the civilians, maybe it's the military, maybe it's bottom up, maybe it's bottom down, or top down, and so on for time eternal. But I think what's helpful when you're talking about this debate is to sort of go back to the original genesis of it, which was really a mid-20th century debate, but it is a debate from which all other things emerge, which is the debate between quantity and quality in World War II. And I'm sure people have heard versions of this. I'll just briefly go through some of that. So on the quantity side of the equation, for those of you who have ever served in uniform, you probably have heard the expression that quantity has a quality all its own, which is essentially rooted in the idea that Allied battlefield weaknesses were overcome by massive amounts of manpower and material. And I think the most sophisticated version of this argument probably comes from WWII, in which he basically makes the case that quantity, the stuff, and the men and women who served, was foundational to American doctrine, right? It was the pillar on which the rest of American doctrine ran. And so I think it is a very good argument. It's probably mostly true in larger scale conventional conflicts of the type that World War II was. But it may be less so in the last 50 or so years, and there are many people in this room who know a lot more about things like unconventional conflict where resources are not indefinite and unbridled. So that's sort of one argument. It tended to be the immediate argument in the wake of World War II about why we won. On the other side is the quality scholars. And I would argue that more recently this has sort of taken on a more popular flavor. People, I think, generally agree with this. But these folks say that when you really look at it, the quantitative advantages that the quantities folks are heralding weren't actually as significant as they looked. They were negligible, in fact, in some conflicts. And actually, victory was a product of endurance, adaptability, and leadership. Some great names here, Mansor, Doubler, and Millet and Murray, who are, of course, icons of the military effect in this field for, again, those of you who care anything about that. Again, I think in recent years, most of the field would find themselves falling in this camp. To a certain extent, I do. But the quantity narrative hasn't gone away, particularly when we talk about sort of large-scale conventional conflict writ large. And you see this a lot in the sort of DC punditry around what might be a future war. If we just have more nukes, if we just have more guns, if we just have more people, then of course we will win, right? That's how it works. And I think the American defense budget speaks volumes to that argument, right? So it's not something that's gone away, and it certainly has animated a lot of the discussion about World War II and the debates of today. Now, I'm going to do something which, as recovering academic, I can do now, but I would have never done years ago, which is to say I think this is kind of a silly debate, actually. And I'll tell you why in a minute. But there are 3 basic reasons why I think it's actually not quite the question that we want to be asking and doesn't elicit much interesting or new about it. And the first reason why I think it's a little bit of a false debate is that it's a false choice. And I think WWII actually gets this right here, which is to say that quantity and quality were actually reinforcing parts of the strategy. That American leaders from the start, that was part of the reason why the Allies wanted them in the first place, wanted us in the first place, is that we had a lot of things and we knew how to use them in an effective way. And so I think to a certain extent it is a false choice. And this I would never get away with saying a couple of years ago. It's overdetermined. World War II is the most, for those of you who are like deep in qualitative methodology, World War II has way too much going on for us to say that one thing won it or didn't win it, right? And I'll incur the wrath of my fellow political scientists later. Historians love when I say this, but I think, and I agree that to say quantity versus quality or leadership or whatever, it's a little too simple. And part of that is because of the perspective issue that I found, which is that depending on where and at what level we look, the answer to this question changes. And in fact, if you look at the cases that are used by the quantity scholars and the quality scholars, these are very different cases. So quantity, it turns out, tends to matter much more in the Pacific, say, in the air power or naval campaign, where, of course, mass matters, than it does, say, in Europe in a ground campaign with conventional forces, where, for instance, some of those quantitative advantages will matter less. So I think this is sort of a major problem of the existing literature, and one that's really bothered me for a long time, but I'll admit that's not very helpful to say that this debate doesn't get us very far. And the question then becomes, where does this leave us? What should we do about it, and what can we say about the debate over World War II that is interesting and compelling for today especially, particularly given what we're talking about in Europe and in Asia right now. And if we accept that quality and quantity both mattered in World War II, if we acknowledge the reality that the US has lots of equipment and personnel, and it uses them well, it begs, I think, several more interesting questions. If we sort of say, both of these things are true, and then what? We get to a more interesting place. And for me, these are the questions that have bothered me a lot since over the past several years. And it's questions like, okay, how did the Allies actually get all of this equipment and personnel to the theater? That seems like a big and difficult task. How did all the forces get the training and the know-how that they would need to use all of this equipment? How did they keep track of all this equipment and all these people? And how did they know where they were needed and when? I mean, this is an enormous war. That seems like a very, very difficult thing to do. And so if we accept that both of these things matter, the question really for me becomes, who did all of this work and how? How did they connect the space? How did they bridge the space in between the massive personnel and equipment advantages that we have and getting it to the theater and making sure it's well used? And that's where this book makes its key sort of academic argument. And I'm going to talk about something that's super not cool, so buckle up, folks. It's called combat support. Not even the name is interesting. But I'll tell you, I hope that by the end of this, you guys are going to be like, this is the coolest thing I've ever learned about the military. So this is a key and deeply underappreciated element of military operations in World War II and today. And I'll talk about those things in a minute, about what it is and how we define it and things of that nature. But the argument at the center of this book is essentially that combat support functions, I'll define them in a second, were an essential component of American and Allied success. And really what I'm talking about here is American, to talk about why, in the battlefield and during World War II. And I make an even more specific argument that it was sort of the link, this missing link between quantity and quality, between the stuff and getting it to the theater where we needed to get it. And just to be clear, you know, this is an axiomatic argument in the military community, particularly among frontline forces, right? They understand the need for combat support, which again, I'll talk about what that actually is. But I would argue that it really has not broken through into the wider, frankly, quite frankly, even the security studies space, and certainly not to the broader public. And that's what a big motivation for this book has been as a military analyst, as someone who thinks about this a lot. And for me, this is particularly frustrating today, right now, when we're talking about the possibility of a ground war, an actual, not even the possibility, but participation in a ground war in Europe, and a massive confrontation with China, right? Because if we are not getting this right, if the message isn't getting through, then we've got a major problem. And in fact, just to make my point, I think we should, I'll talk about in a second what exactly that means and how that manifests in the current day. But I just want to first talk about sort of what combat support is and how we define it so that everybody's on the same page, because it is a pretty niche thing. So combat support, this is a very much a where you sit is where you stand problem, right? So depending on who you ask and when, it looks a little bit different, but I take a pretty broad brush to it. I'm talking about the generation, support, transport, sustenance, and allocation of material and men in combat. And I think it's especially helpful here to look at examples, because I think not everybody necessarily understands these things intuitively, and compare it, for instance, to combat elements, so frontline elements. The shorthand that you can use for this, I think, is combat elements tend to be the sort of elements that are the guys with guns shooting at the enemy, right? That's the best shorthand you can think of. So that means things like infantry, armor, cavalry, artillery, air defense. They are engaging with the enemy on the front line. The combat support part of this is a little bit less sexy, as I mentioned before. It's not the more interesting part of it. But these are the folks who tend to be specialists in their field, and they enable and enhance these frontline elements. So these are things like communications units, medical units, maintenance and supply, transportation units, personnel units, those sorts of things. And so just to illustrate the point, I think, a little bit more clearly, I'm a person who needs a lot of examples. Communications units, how are they enabling and enhancing the battlefield effect, right? If you're doing a large-scale sort of ground maneuver in, say, France, in, say, 1944, you might need to talk to units that are miles away. And how do you talk to them? Through communications units, literally laying cables between headquarters and various other elements on the battlefield. Same thing goes for supply forces or maintenance forces. These are the folks who are making hard decisions about who gets what and when, and how things are allocated at any given moment. And then finally, like personnel, like the HR department of the Army, how could they possibly be the most important part of World War II? Well, I'll tell you right now, when you've got 16 million people serving in uniform in World War II, you need to know where they are and what they're doing and what the battlefield looks like. And so these combat support elements are, in my view, just a critical and overlooked piece of the conversation. And so while these forces may never fire a bullet at an enemy soldier, I argue in the book that they are critically important. So, okay. As I mentioned before, this is pretty axiomatic in the military community. This is something that a lot of people know and understand. But it's not necessarily widespread in our current debate. And as I mentioned before, as if to prove my point, on Tuesday, the New York Times put out this beautiful article. They said, oh, Lena, you're giving a talk. Let's prove your point. Right? So some of you may have heard that there was a huge debate in Germany about whether or not we would give Leopard 2 tanks to the Ukrainians, because it turns out they need them in a large-scale ground war in Europe. And it turns out they're not ready. Why? They're not being maintained. So, and we're talking here about like dozens of tanks, and just for a sense of perspective, we produced over 80,000 tanks in World War II. So if we can't get dozens of tanks to Ukraine today because they're not being maintained, think about the scale of that problem in a, say, massive confrontation with East Asian state, or a massive confrontation with Russia. So this is as much an issue today as it was in World War II, and this is part, again, of the motivation for the book itself. So, okay, combat support, you're all convinced, is the most important thing in World War II, even though I've already said it's overdetermined, there's no one thing. But you think it's important now, you understand what it is, hopefully. If not, we can talk about it a little bit more in the Q&A. But the question becomes, if I can convince this room of it, how do I convince the rest of the world of it? Because this has been a bee in my bonnet for a long time. I've been thinking about World War II for a long time. And I need something that people will pay attention to. But I'm still a military analyst, so I want it to be like interesting and true. And you guessed it, here they are, combat support and women. So there are several reasons we want to talk about women in World War II. The first reason, and I'll just say this because we should just say it, women's stories matter, period. We should just talk about women and what they have going on in their lives. Not just as one, because I'm a narcissist, but also I think but this is particularly important to people like me who use historical and qualitative methods. And I'll tell you this for the burgeoning scholars in the room, if you are excising an entire population from your research, then you are not doing good research, right? So understanding women's war experiences mean you are understanding the war experience. And so that's reason number one. Reason number two, and this is just me being a salesman, there has been a recent surge of interest in women's stories in World War II, which is helpful for lots of reasons. I'm very excited about it. I'm probably the single greatest booster of stories about women in World War II. I buy every book, I go to every movie, I bring all of my friends and family, they're sick of it. But there is sort of recently this surge about what are these stories that we've been missing? So why not capitalize on that? And then finally, as a military analyst, I think this is the most important thing. They are extremely illustrative of a very key point that I just made to you mere moments ago, which is that when you look at women in World War II, they happen to be in combat support functions. And if you're someone like me who cares a lot about combat support functions and getting that story out there, it turns out that women in World War II are the perfect way to do it. And that is basically the genesis of the book. And now that we've dispensed with that, we can just talk about the fun stuff, which are all these 100-year-old ladies who in their time were complete heroes. They were fantastic. So, okay, some overarching points about this holy grail that I've identified. These illustrative, important, and interesting women. The facts. Over 350,000 American servicewomen served in World War II. They were in every theater, they were in every combat service, and they were in the majority of military occupations at the time. 2 caveats. I'm talking here about servicewomen, so women who were in uniform. There's some fantastic stories about women in manufacturing and women in the civil service, also very cool. We can talk about those later, but I'm not going to talk about them today. And I am talking about American women because, quite frankly, the story of women writ large is just too big to tell in a single book. But I have some recommendations if you're interested. And then the other thing I'd like to mention, for any of those World War II watchers, if you exist anymore, increasingly convinced I'm the only one, but 350,000 is actually kind of a small number. You're like, oh, how could they matter? And I just told you 16 million personnel served in World War II, so that's not a big percent of 16 million. So what does that mean for my book, my theory, my thoughts? Well, it turns out, if you compare the amount of personnel who served in World War II to anything, it looks small. Korea looks like a rounding error compared to World War II. 350,000 people is about the number of people who stormed the beaches at Normandy. It's also about twice the size of the current day Marine Corps. So if you think this is a small number that can't have a big impact, I encourage you to talk to a Marine about it. So it is, I recognize that as a challenge here. I talk about it and sort of dispense with it in the book, but I'm very happy to talk with that, to talk to folks about that afterward. Okay, let's talk about why women in World War II even show up, right? Because this is the first war. Now, women as nurses certainly have been in the military since the Revolutionary War. But what is it about World War II that means that women have to serve for the first time in all the services in uniform? And for this, we need to look no further than my favorite commander of World War II, the genius, the logistician, the total military nerd, George C. Marshall, who is basically in charge of American military strategy, army strategy really, but broadly, is one of the most important voices. And as early as May 1940, so we're talking well before Pearl Harbor, he is fixated in his personal papers, and I mean like laser focused on the issue of personnel. He cannot think about anything else. It's this and time are his two most pressing concerns, and specifically they won't have enough people in time for the war that he sees coming. Also, poor guy was sworn in as Army Chief of Staff on the day that the Germans invaded Poland. Talk about a bad first day. So he's consumed by this issue of personnel, of manpower, and I use the term manpower here because that's a term that was used before. Obviously, I'm talking about a bigger group of people. So he's fixated on it. The question, of course, is why? There are a lot of people in the United States. It's a big country even then, so why should he be so concerned about personnel? And it really comes down to a math problem, and I'll just do the math for you really quickly. All you have to do is look at the census in 1940. It doesn't look very good. So you have men in 1940, about 66 million men. Men of military age, about a third of that. We're talking about 25 million men. White men of military age, because remember, of course, black men could serve, but in very narrow positions, in very sort of limited roles. It brings us to about 20 million. And here is the big issue, folks. It's deferment. Marshall understands, and quite frankly, all of the senior leadership at the time understands, that because of this quantity-quality strategy, there's a whole manufacturing industry that has to go on in the United States while supporting massive invasions across the globe. So there's this sort of dual pressure. We can't rob Peter to pay Paul here. We need to maintain the manufacturing base in the United States, which is basically the same population of men, and also send these folks overseas to fight the actual war. And that means, and the Army by its own admission in 1941 says this, that about 8 to 10 million men are available for service. And by 1940, 1941, it's very clear that that is not going to be enough given the scope of the war and Hitler and the Japanese ambitions at the time. So, okay, let's talk about the women's programs. So, excuse me, the math doesn't look very good, and most of the commanders realize that they're going to need women, and that's exactly what they do. Sorry, my son got me very sick last week. So I'm better now, I promise. Anyway, so they all sort of acknowledge we have this math problem, how do we fix it? We've got to start opening our doors to people who we might not otherwise open them to. And every single service, eventually, and not without much tooth pulling in some cases, decides women are going to be a part of the service. And I'll talk about each of these services briefly because they all have an incredible story, which if you want to learn more about, you should read the book. But essentially, these are the main components. The Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, which is the Army's version of the women's program. They have about 150,000 women who serve in uniform throughout the course of the war. They later become the WWII. They dropped the auxiliary, which is a fascinating story, which I don't have time for today. The WAVES, another cute name, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. These are the Navy women. About 100,000 women serve in the Navy in World War II. The Army and Navy Nurse Corps are the third largest together. They're about 70,000, although the Army Nurse Corps is doing a lot of that work. Some of the most fascinating, dangerous, insane stories you'll ever hear come from nurses. Wow, those guys were incredible. And I'm not going to talk about them today, but just ask that question, please, someone. Okay, and then we're done with the cutesy names. We're back to the Marines. This is just the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. That's it. They were called Women Marines. And there's a very funny story about why. But anyway, they total about 18,000 women. The Coast Guard SPAR is very small at 11,000. And then the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, who were technically a civilian organization, later were recognized as having a military component. They're only about 1,000. That's because they're some of the most incredible pilots in the country. And I'll talk a little bit about who they are. So those are all of the services. And one of the main goals of this project was to take illustrative examples that were interesting and fun and compelling from each of these services and use it to tell a story about combat support. And essentially, that's what I'm going to do for the remaining few minutes that we have here. And I'll take a few examples from the book that I think are especially illustrative of particular combat support issues that were very pressing then and I think will be very pressing today as we think about potential conflict in pretty much everywhere. So my hope here is that I can demonstrate 2 points, which is that women's stories are interesting and fun, and also that they tell something militarily interesting about the war. And so if I've done that in the next several minutes, then I will have succeeded here. Okay, so let's talk about one of the first big issues, combat support issues in World War II. And I mentioned this early on. This is transport. There is a lot of stuff in World War II to get literally, for the first time ever, all over the globe, right? And this isn't like horses or guys with like a gun. We're talking huge tanks, aircraft, big technical radar, which like if you jiggle the wrong way in 1942 just breaks, like turns into smoke. These are really technical, sophisticated, heavy machines that are very difficult to transport. And so this becomes a major issue, right? You're trying to get things from point A to point B when point B is a battlefield. And it's an enormous undertaking, and an especially large one in World War II. And this is nowhere more the case than when it comes to American air power, which basically has its debut as an offensive tool of war in World War II. And this is also what I wrote my dissertation on, so I apologize if I get too deep into it. But essentially, right, both Roosevelt and Marshall were major proponents of air power having a huge and independent effect on the battlefield. They elevate the Air Force very early in the war, and they know, for example, in 1943, that this is going to be a huge material undertaking. In that year, the United States, I think I'll get this right, is producing twice as many aircraft as Japan and Germany combined. If you add the UK into it, it's still more. So we're producing a lot of big planes. The problem, of course, is that there is a lot of stuff, and it's being produced at different places in the United States, but we're not using it. Like a plane in Topeka, Kansas isn't going to fight the war. And they have very specific doctrinal demands for these planes. So I'm talking about the strategic bombing campaign, ground support, or air support of ground forces, these sorts of things. They're really critical to the way that the war is fought and won overseas, but they've got to get there. The Army knew this was the case. They knew that there was going to be a lot of fighting with planes abroad. And they sort of shot themselves in the foot. In 1941 and 1942, they basically say, any man with a pilot's license, nice to meet you, please put on an Air Force uniform, you are now a pilot for the United States of America, and they ship them overseas. So this means that you have lots of planes being produced in the United States with nowhere to go and nowhere to fly them, no one to fly them. And this question becomes, or the question becomes essentially, how do we get these planes consolidated in the United States into where they need to go? And it turns out women do it. So this is Florine Miller. She's a phenomenal Texan. She is so interesting. I didn't get the chance to meet her, but I've read I've listened to many of her totally engaging interviews. She is part of the early cadre of women who learned how to fly in the 1930s based on like the barnstorming events that used to happen in the South and at the turn of the century. She gets her instructor's rating, which is really impressive for any of you. I don't know if there are any pilots in the room, but she does this before the war begins. And she is actually teaching men how to fly when the war starts. So obviously very good at her job. She joins the WASP, which again is the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, and one of their first classes is sent to Dallas, where she oversees a group of women flyers posted there. I can tell you some harrowing stories about her, but suffice it to say that she gets pulled in very quickly to what is called, to a problem that is trying to be solved by the Air Transport Command at the time. These are the folks who are responsible for picking up planes at manufacturing places and moving them to bases and then getting them sent overseas. And those guys, the Air Transport Command estimates they need more pilots than exist in the Air Force in 1943 to move planes around the United States than they have. And so Florine Miller basically arrives and starts doing this job. She almost dies in several planes. Basically, like once a month, she's got a close call. I can talk about why that's the case and why women had uniquely hazardous jobs in these roles. But the cool thing about Florine Miller, she's qualified on most of the fighter and combat aircraft in the United States because of this role, because she's basically picking them up, moving them around, and getting them to flyers where they're needed. So that's Florine Miller. She's helping with the transport issue. The next issue, maintenance. Another really cool, super interesting thing that lots of people like to talk about. This is in some ways the flip side of the transport issue, and this becomes much more of a problem in the late 1943 and 1944, where we have all these things, they're being moved. Florine Miller is like crushing it, she's flying planes around, doing a fantastic job. But the problem is when you send a lot of this equipment into battle, as I just mentioned, it's very delicate equipment, it gets damaged, it gets broken. And it becomes much more efficient to send it back to the United States often, or if you can in theater, but it's hard to do that, to fix these big machines. And I think anyone who's ever owned a high-tech piece of equipment has experienced this issue. It's often easier to just like fix the part than to buy a whole new thing. But to give you a sense of what this looked like for the maintenance issues for the American military in World War II, the Army in 1944 spends $1 billion a month on maintenance, right? So that's a lot of money to spend on this task. And the Navy is not far behind. They, by 1944, they're starting their march toward Japan's doorstep, which means they're putting a lot of equipment into the Pacific. And the problem with an offensive across massive plains of water is that you need a lot of landing crafts and boats and ships and airplanes to do it. So by 1944 or 1945, they are producing about 80,000 landing craft, 1,000 combatant vessels. They've got a lot of stuff that needs to be repaired, essentially. But the manpower constraints that Marshall was so concerned about in 1940 have not gone away. In fact, they've gotten much worse at this point. And so again, they're not quite willing to take men from the front or even men from the rear areas and pull them back to the United States to fix altimeters, right? That's not a good use of personnel, but it's still something that needs to get done, which is where women like Jessie Contrabecki come in. And I did have the privilege of talking to Jessie. She is very unassuming, but boy, is she something else. She never berated me, but she did have some strong views. She had for those of you who are wondering what the Depression was like, it was not great. She was born on a kitchen table in Niagara Falls. 6 of her siblings died of malnutrition before she was born. And she was basically placed in a home because her dad was an abusive alcoholic, not a nice guy. But part of the silver lining to this is that she works, she very quickly has to become independent, and she transitions to the Bell Aircraft Corporation right after high school, which becomes a very important thing for her. And she gets bored of it pretty quickly and enlists in the WAVE, so the Navy service, and is trained at Hunter College, which was called the USS Hunter at the time. Anyway, so she's an incredibly important part of the maintenance picture here, and I'll tell you this because I should say you should know this because she's here at Jacksonville, Naval Air Station Jacksonville, which is one of the largest overhaul and repair depots in the United States. It's basically where a lot of naval planes will go to get fixed, and she's an instrument mechanic, which means she is literally fixing gauges and altimeters all day. There are a couple things that make her really good at this work and make her, quite frankly, better than most of the men. She has tiny hands. Turns out that's really helpful when you're fixing like clocks and tiny parts. She is familiar with aircraft because, as I mentioned, she worked at the Bell Aircraft Corporation, and this is a theme that you see with a lot of women. They were often in private sector jobs that were directly translated into their work in the military, so she had a lot of familiarity with aircraft. She was also in uniform, so she could be put wherever the Navy wanted to put her. And she was so good at her job that essentially she became the main trainer for every man who came through Jacksonville, and particularly the O&R department. So she's an incredible woman, and she is sort of on the front line of the maintenance picture in World War II. Okay, and then the final one I'll talk about, and I just felt it was important to put this in because I don't want to give folks the impression that women were only at home. They certainly were not. Over 50,000 women served abroad in combat theaters during World War II, and this is my favorite example of them. So it's hard to overstate how important signals units were. They're basically communications units in World War II. But there are two things going on here. One, signals units matter a lot. They particularly matter abroad, though, in 1944 and 1945, because around then, we decided that we're going to cap the number of forces that can be sent to the theater. That makes all of those concerns I talked about with Marshall and manpower even more paramount. And so what ends up happening is that the Army is forced to take men from the rear areas of the battlefield, so like right where the action is happening, and move them up to the front line. Because at this point, we've capped the number of divisions, and we still have invasions in the Philippines, Japan, most of Europe, right? There's still major ground campaigns coming, and we don't have more men coming over. So they take them from the rear areas, and they need to fill them in. And I think one of the most interesting areas of this is communications unit, because as I mentioned before, they're a key part of sort of any battlefield advances, making sure that first higher headquarters is connected with the front line, and also that the front line is connected with itself. And I just want to mention that this is not the communications units of today. There is no wireless. These are literal cables. There is no machine translation. These are literal people who speak French. This is a slow and deliberate process that requires a lot of work, and you have to have a very niche set of skills. So that's where women like Gertrude Pearson come in. This is, I got these from the archives, and I talk a little bit about my research. I spent a lot of time in the archives. There's some great oral histories that exist. She's from New York. She grew up in the Bronx, which at that time was very pastoral and lovely, I'm told. She signed up for the WWII basically because she wanted to go abroad, so it's the Army's version of this. She's trained at Daytona Beach, and it turns out they tell her she's going to be an administrator, but actually she's going to be a cryptologist, which is much cooler. So she is almost instantly sent to France. And just to give you a sense of what she was doing, she was part of one of the few units that was all women, signals units that was all women. They're part of the deception campaign. For those of you who know anything about the Normandy invasion, there's a big deception campaign that was happening separately, where they're just flooding the Germans with fake noise and over there. And it worked very well. And Pearson was doing exactly that. She was part of the signals units that were doing that deception campaign. And then 3 months after the invasion, she shows up on Omaha Beach and gets in a foxhole and follows the front for the remainder of the war, literally laying the cables and doing a lot of the transmission work that the higher headquarters needed to maintain contact with the front, which at that point had really slowed down. So it's women like Gertrude Pearson, it's women like Florine Miller, it's women like Jessie Contrabecki, who are filling in these gaps that exist and are essential, and they're filling them in everywhere. For me, a great joy of this work was to be able to illustrate that point through the perspective of these women, to sort of flip it on its head. And it was really joyful work to do, I have to say. This was the best project I've ever worked on. But I don't want to give the impression that it was like a walk in the park for these women. I don't have enough time to talk about it today. It's a major theme of the book, and I'm very, very happy to talk about this in the Q&A. There were 4 big buckets of things that faced women right from the start. The first was a very dishonorable, is probably the most pleasant word I can use for it, campaign to slander the women, specifically of the WWII, of the Women's Army Corps. These folks made use of a really silly trope that's plagued women, that had plagued women for a long time, and essentially argued that the women of the WWII were prostitutes, and they were there to sleep with the men for morale purposes. They started this campaign soon after it started, and just to give you a sense of the damage that it did, when the WWII started recruiting, they overshot their initial target by 600%. That's how much women wanted to serve in the US military, and in the Army in particular. After this campaign, they rarely met their goals, because it was so public, and it was so scandalous, and it was just like perfectly pointed at the heart of what everyone worried about with women joining the military, that it just devastated the recruiting campaign. The other issue I didn't get time to talk about, but again, happy to talk about later, is the fact that 2 major facts. One, the Army was segregated. That was the policy of the day. This was also the case for women in the Army. The Navy later integrates their forces in 1944, but it's basically like right before the war ends, and we can talk about that later. But essentially, in the book, I have the stories of several Black women who served in uniform. I had the great pleasure of interviewing a woman named Miss Bailey, who did berate me several times, and she's just the best. I love her. She passed away recently, but she had an incredible experience in the Army, but she did experience a great deal of segregation and racism. Her stories are incredible, and to me, just totally illustrative of some of the key issues around this. And segregation and racism was not limited to Black women who served. There were many Asian American women who served. There were Latino women who served. And I have several stories, particularly of Asian American women who served, who encountered very similar issues. And so this was not something that was sort of talked about at the time widely, but it was definitely the case. And again, I'm happy to dive into that a little bit later. Unsurprisingly, sexual harassment and sexual violence were a huge issue and a totally unreported issue. Most of the women that I talked to in person acknowledged that sexual harassment was just sort of what happened to them in their lives at that time, and that they didn't really have the tools or the language to talk about it. Sexual violence was very rarely reported and strikingly common, not just against women in uniform, but broadly, particularly in the theater. Some really horrifying stories there. And really the way that the Army and the military more broadly dealt with it was abhorrent. I won't share those stories now, but I'm happy to if folks want to talk about it later. And then finally, lesbian and queer women. This was a fun and interesting and sometimes sad surprise for me in talking about and researching this. So there were some women who sought out the women's military programs because they were filled with women and they liked women. So what a good place to meet somebody to start a life with. There were others who found themselves kind of unexpectedly in relationships with women after being initiated into the military. And there were still others who were deeply homophobic, including most of the military leadership at the time. And so there was a really very interesting mix of forces going on here. It's not very publicly talked about or known. I have a couple cases where it's unclear what the nature of the relationship was, and I talk about them in the book. But it raises a lot of really interesting issues. I think obviously there's a huge conversation right now happening in the military about gender identity, but it's just a good reminder that none of this is new, right? We've been talking about it for decades in very public and public ways. So again, it wasn't all a walk in the park for the women, but the ultimate result was that in 1948, with the major push from Dwight Eisenhower, who had been a very huge skeptic of the program when it started and became one of its biggest proponents, later as Army Chief of Staff, women are incorporated into the US military permanently and have been there ever since, and I think we're all glad for it. And it's this quote I like to end on because I think it's a good reminder that we're often afraid of change for reasons that are spooky and very nebulous. But when the rubber meets the road, the benefits here certainly outweighed those nebulous downsides. And again, it has just been a pleasure to do this work, and I hope has convinced you that not only are women interesting, but so is combat support. And I am happy to take questions and have a discussion with folks. Yes.
So I'm going to kick it off by going back to your quantity versus quality thing. And ask you whether you think that combat support operated differently because there were a significant number of women involved, or if you think that had there been enough men to just fill all those roles with men, it would have functioned exactly the same.
Great question. Eventually, yes. And I think men are just as capable of doing combat support. They have and do, just in case any men in the room are worried. You can do it. It's a great question, though. And here's why. I think because, and I didn't have time to talk about this, but it's and every single commander answers this question the same way, essentially, at the time, which is, yes, men can do these roles. It turns out, though, women tend to be trained for these roles already, and they often replace 2 or 3 men in those positions, right? So this was especially the case in terms of things like secretarial and administrative work, and for those of you who think that's not important in the U.S. military in World War II, then I have done a very bad job in this talk. It is the most important thing in World War II. Paperwork matters here. And especially things like indexing and getting things right and making sure that it's in the right place and people can find it quickly when it's repeated millions and millions of times a day. That matters a lot. And women are going to business school in 1935 for this task. So when they arrive at the doorstep of the military, for people like Eisenhower, who comes into the North Africa campaign, hating the idea of women being on his staff, he realizes that his guys can't keep up with the paperwork in the headquarters for the North Africa campaign. That becomes a real issue for him. And so he calls up Marshall and he says, "Can you send some women over here?" And that's exactly what they do. And so I think the answer is yes, combat support can be done very successfully by men, and they did it very successfully. And as I mentioned before, it's a small number of women, so there were lots of men doing these jobs very well. But I do think the women, because of their training, had a really outsized impact in their roles, and often were sort of, you got more bang for your buck out of the women who were showing up. And the other thing I'll say, and this was the commanders of the women's programs were very, very bullish about this. They knew that women could be trained for these tasks and would be satisfied with these tasks, right? They weren't here to get their guy and, get the Nazis on the front line. That wasn't necessarily, some of them were actually, some of them really hated these guys, rightly so. But they were eager to be a part of the military in whatever way they could. So not only were they trained to be excellent secretaries or trained to be nurses, this is definitely the case when it came to the nurse corps, but they were totally satisfied when they arrived in, Cleveland, and they were, this is it for me. And they did that really well. And so I think the answer is yes, the combat support functioned differently, and I think it functioned better where women were there. Now, that was not something that was widely known even then, and a lot of the slander campaign came from men who had never met a woman who was serving in those roles. The men who did meet them and who did engage them, like Eisenhower himself, were totally blown away by their effectiveness. So I think that's probably the best answer in that respect. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
This is excellent talk. It was perfectly situated, as our annual one. So thank you for coming and doing it. I want to look at the other end of the spectrum, so instead of what you started with, sort of what you finished with. I thought the controversy was really interesting because you made such a compelling case for how important these women were and how everyone was so excited to serve, and this was this war effort that everyone just kind of couldn't wait in some ways to get into. And then comes on the heels of this enormous rally effect with Pearl Harbor. Why would a slander campaign have been effective at all? It seems like totally infertile ground, right?
Yeah.
You've got Marshall saying we need more people, and you've got everyone recognizing they need help, and they're not even putting women on the front line. Why would this have even taken off, and why couldn't they come out of it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think, right, part of this is maybe I should have presented this a little bit more fairly. You can tell where I land on this. But I think there was significant pushback, particularly in Congress, and some of this might sound familiar to you. There was a lot of pushback about incorporating women into the military services, in large part because this is a major moment of flux in how we think about American women in society writ large, right? So there is this enormous need, and this is also the case, I think, for most of Black America as well. There's like major changes going on societally, and you can find people to fill the entire sort of spectrum of views on these things. And Congress, the congressional debates over this are actually the best manifestation of the range of views here. And there is a really strong and vocal component filled with both men who are sort of worried about. There's a great quote that I use in the book, which is like, what will become of American manhood if we let women into the military? And it's like true shock, like worry, what does this say about our men? So there's that, but there's also women, a lot of women actually in the pacifist movement, who felt that this was totally anathema, right? Post-World War I, after this huge scarring conflict, to then put anyone back in combat, and certainly not women. They were also very against it. So I think there was a lot of churn in American society, and again, the way that I presented it here, and I think the conclusion we've arrived at subsequently is that this was a good thing, but at the time it was very much a subject of debate. And I think part of what made it so successful is that they really found this guy who did the article is named John O'Donnell, and I hate him. But he, I don't know him or his family, he may have been a nice guy, I don't know, but he did some real damage, and he picks the perfect rumor, he picks the perfect thing. And he basically says that in the article that women are being issued prophylactics, condoms and things to deal with sex. And it's not even an explicit admission, or I shouldn't say admission, an explicit accusation that it was because these women were doing nefarious things sexually, but it was just the implication. That's all it took, and then it just was like wildfire, and largely in these communities where people didn't know much about the WWII, it was still early in the programs, they were wondering about it. So he just picked the perfect thing, and there was enough of a sort of conversation about women at this time, and what they would be good at or not good at, that it worked almost like beautifully for the folks who were worried about this. Which is a real shame, I think, because for all the reasons that we've talked about, they were doing such important work. So, yeah. Yes?
Well, I wanted to say that I think the slander still goes on. We have a lot of military in our programs here. We have a National Reconnaissance Office campus. Just this past week, women were telling me of being bullied out of being fighter pilots, or changing their names to fit. And so I think what you're doing is great. I mean, 60 years later, we're doing what our governor, I think, tasked us with this week. He said, not just to talk about ain't it awful, but how we build a bridge. And this bridge of information needs to be known.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's just,
No, I'm glad you said it, because I think for me, and I'm sure many people in the room feel this way, when you look at history long enough, it looks very familiar. And almost all of the issues today, if you excise the names from them, you'd hear them in Congress or in the larger conversation about women serving in the military, about anyone who's different serving in the military. And for me, a key part of this project was saying, again, these debates are not new. The problems that we're facing are not new, and we've solved them so many times. Like why we've come up with the answers so many times before. And so part of this is a combat support. I don't want to lose that. Part of that is about combat support. But also part of it is bringing attention to the wider public in a way that hopefully speaks to them. That if you have a problem with women serving today in the military, or if you don't want them to be fighter pilots, because God forbid we have to make new uniforms for them, how could we? Then I want you to talk to General Eisenhower or General Marshall or Hap Arnold, who loved women pilots and thought they were fantastic, and in fact designed new uniforms for them, right? So to me that's a really key, and thank you for bringing it up. I think it's part of why I'm so excited to be here today is that vision is shared. Yeah, Grace Wetter back there.
Of the women that you interviewed, how many of them made a career after World War II ended and stuck with it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's hard to tell because there was it's not a huge gap, but there was enough of a gap between the end of the war, 46 essentially, technically, and 48 where they can be officially part of the regular forces. Many returned, so many were sent, basically all of them were sent home. There was a small, very small cadre of women who were like sort of there because they knew that Eisenhower and others wanted them to stay. Some went straight into the civil service. That's why you see a lot of women who, for instance, went into the intelligence profession. I didn't talk about that here, but the intelligence story is a very interesting one. It's been told in other places, but really cool. So a lot of women went there because it was, until 1947, still sort of more civil servicey than anything else. But it's hard to know how many then re-upped. One place where it was the case was often the women pilots, the WASPs, which is this really small group. Like for instance, Jackie Corcoran, who's an amazing woman, very controversial, super interesting. She, because it was a civilian program, I think a lot of them were eager to sort of get the credit that they rightly deserved, and the program was shut down before the end of the war. So you see a lot of pilots going back in once the Air Force accepts women. And this is a time where the Air Force is sort of at its peak. This is like Cold War, everybody's planes all day. So I think that's probably the place where you see most women, but again, it's hard to get those figures. And for those of you who are interested in the aftermath, a fantastic book just came out called Her Cold War by Tanya Roth. And it's probably the best assessment of sort of Cold War women's experiences in the military that I've ever read. It's fantastic, and I highly recommend it. So she may have an answer to that. Yeah, red sweater back there.
Was it challenging in sort of getting in touch with a lot of the women you interviewed, given that they've been out of the service for many, many years, etc.? Did you have to go into military records and that sort of thing?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I love talking about my research methods, so thank you for the flattery. So part of the difficulty was this is a COVID project. So I had a whole full-time job that I was doing before this, and then everything stopped, and I got very bored, and so I wrote a book.
Netflix didn't do it for you.
Me and Taylor Swift had a very productive COVID. Same, anyway, sorry. You have a very good question. I don't want to get away from it. But here's the great thing about COVID. Is that around 2021, when the first vaccines were coming out, a lot of elderly people were getting COVID shots, and they were getting a ton of press. And something that they love to put in press is woman veteran gets COVID shot. And which is total surprise to me. If there was any silver lining of COVID, I'm surprised it was that. But it was like this fantastic, I basically put a Google alert for women who were getting COVID shots and were veterans. And the other thing is, people were really looking for great good news stories, and a lot of women just happened to be turning 100 when I was doing this research because of the timing. So a lot of my interviews actually came from that sort of fortuitous set of circumstances. In the end, I spoke to, I think, 7 or 8 living women, and I spoke to the families of about, I think, a dozen, maybe 15, and a lot of them had old records and letters and sent me that sort of stuff. The sort of flip side of that is that I did want to do a lot of archival research because I knew there were records and I knew of them, and the NARA was closed for all of COVID. And so I have in my acknowledgments a very long and intense thank you to archivists who basically very kindly did a lot of my archival research for me. I would tell them what files I want, they went in and scanned them, they said, oh, I think this is interesting, and then I finally got back in the end. But just to give you a sense of some of the stuff that's in the archives that people don't see, and that really helps my research, in addition to these amazing interviews that I did, which were just so fun, also talking to a 103-year-old over Zoom is a treat. It's amazing. So supplementing that was this archival research, and to give you an example, I had my woman at one of the best archivists I've ever engaged with at NARA. She found one of the records of the investigations of allegations of homosexuality at one of the WWII centers, and it blew open the case for me. And there's a whole chapter in the book about these allegations and the nature of the investigation and what that did to morale. They have interviews with the women. They have records. I mean, can you imagine having your love letters entered into the National Archives of the United States for time eternal? I can't, but these poor women had them there. But it proved to be an enormous value for me. And this was the case also at places like Smith, where there were training centers. The archivists there were fantastic. Harvard, same thing. Wellesley, I got into those. And so the combination of those things and sort of the creativity and silver linings of COVID really helped with that. But it's a good point that you make, and I put this at the end of the book. We are losing veterans of this war every day. We are especially losing women veterans of this war every day. And if you have the opportunity to talk to one of them, ask them questions, listen to what they say, And that, I would say, goes for all women veterans. I think it's really important to hear these stories and to acknowledge them while we can, because I can't tell you how many families said, man, I wish you'd been here 5 years ago when my aunt was a little more lucid, or was around. She has some amazing stories, and I don't have them anymore. So, you know, it's my exhortation for all of you. Yes? Yeah.
Coming back to your issue about the strategic importance of quantity versus quality, is something that hasn't gone away with the ending of World War II, and I think we're seeing significant tension around it even today. And part of it resonates with your emphasis on the importance of combat support functions. I think we're seeing a situation in Ukraine, for example, where on the one hand, the ability of Russia to mobilize large amounts of material and personnel, move them into Ukraine, and are being increasingly confronted successfully by, I would call it, more thoughtful strategic choices with more sometimes higher quality weapons. The other thing that seems to be happening, and I wondered if you'd agree, is that the Ukrainians are mobilizing women to a much greater extent than the Russians are, playing a variety of roles, but especially in the combat support functions that you're talking about. And it just seems to me that the lessons that you're drawing from in World War II might not yet have been learned in one of the key battleground areas of that war.
Yeah, you know, you're absolutely right. And, you know, I think necessity is the mother of invention, right? And so, and I didn't have time to talk about this, there are fascinating stories of women in other services in other countries. The Soviets and the Russians actually do this in an incredible way. If you haven't read about the Night Witches, I encourage you to Google them. Not the best time to be writing about successful Soviet operations in the current climate, but they are fascinating. And I think a lot of that was born out of necessity. This was, you know, you think about Germany, who also used women very well, the UK, right? Their population is not big enough to sustain the manpower that we have. And so we sort of have the luxury of not thinking about manpower concerns until it is literally of such a scale that we've never, it's unprecedented. But the UK and other states that are smaller and dealing with more resource constraints and don't have a manufacturing industry that is enormous, they don't get that privilege. They have to think about these things. They've got to use everybody. It is total war for them every time there is a war. And I think the Ukrainians probably today, I confess I don't know too much about the Ukrainian situation on the ground, but my sense is they're at a very similar spot, right? Nobody can sit at home. You know, I just read an amazing New York Times piece about a woman who enlisted in the Ukrainian forces, and I think she was a teacher, and what her experience was like. And she's on the front lines, right? It's a very different dynamic. But I do think, to your earlier point, the combat support element of this is, you know, even today, and I don't want to give the impression that women aren't on the front lines, they are very much today. And, you know, I think that's a whole nother conversation I would love to talk to folks about, how they're succeeding in ways that are unexpected ways on the front lines in combat roles. But the combat support element has not gone away, and women still tend to be very good at some of these tasks, right? Because it is overwhelmingly where you see them. You know, I think about that a lot, particularly in things like intelligence, which is also not a frontline task necessarily. And we've seen historically, and we see today, a lot of women succeeding in that field. So I completely agree with your point, essentially. I think it's a great one, and a big part of this book has been about making that point over and over again in an interesting way so that people pick up on that. So I'm glad you did.
I think we have time for one
Oh,
more.
I'm sorry, yes, I'm getting too far ahead of myself. Do you want to be the final question?
Sure. Thank you, Alina. This was really wonderful. You're like a good MITer by spending your whole time on tail. So
I didn't use the term tail though. Okay, you're okay.
It's a very bad joke. But I have a question actually related to, so in my civil conflict class last week, we talked about how the role of women in civil conflict is both understudied and underappreciated. And one of the themes that comes out of that is that it's often uniquely dangerous for women because of the informal roles that they're put into. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. You mentioned it in passing in the talk, but that would be really interesting to hear about how kind of this informal nature of being involved in combat puts you in uniquely challenging and dangerous spots.
I'm so glad you asked it, because I think it's a perfect way to end the talk, which is to say, combat support, while maybe not the most important or coolest thing that everybody thinks of, can be quite dangerous, right? And so the best example of this is the WWII, who I talked about earlier, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots. And because this was a civilian organization at the time, even though they wore, you know, like makeshift uniforms and they were doing these things that were very military, and they were reporting to Arnold all this stuff. They were essentially military, but they were technically civilian for lots of reasons I won't get into right now. They were in some of the most dangerous tasks you can imagine. Cross-country flying in 1942 is not a fun thing to do, particularly because you don't have oxygen in most of these planes. So you're flying at 10,000 feet, which FYI is where thunderstorms are. Not a good day for most of these women. But here's the kicker. The men who were assigned to maintain their planes didn't like it, right? They don't want to be assigned to women. That's not their job. Or they were not very useful at the bases where they were, so they were easily put on this other side task of helping women, which means that the planes that they were flying were often not well maintained. And it means that when you're doing this sort of flying, that becomes a very risky enterprise. And again, in 1942, this is not a safe time to be flying a plane already, so add to that the maintenance concerns. Now, here's the informal part of this. The flip side is that many air commanders realized that one of the best ways to motivate a male pilot is to embarrass him publicly in front of his friends. And the best way to do that is to have a woman do his job better than him. So what they would do is, for instance, in the case of the B-26, which had a very, very bad reputation because of the way it had to be landed, it was called the Widowmaker. None of the guys would fly it. They hated it. And so one of the ways that they got men to fly it is they took 2 women of the WASP, they took them to the training base, and I said, could you go fly the B-26 and show the men how it's done? And they did exactly that. They did it beautifully. Why? They followed the instructions. That's just the honest truth. They followed the manual. And then the guys suddenly get back into the cockpit. But they realize that this happens, and so they really, women are really good motivators for our guys. So we'll just put them in the really dangerous planes, and then show all the guys that they should be able to do it too. But this is that sort of like informal space where women get tasked with these insane things, and ultimately it's a good thing for the force, but it's maybe not such a good thing for the women who are in the cockpit. So I think it's exactly right, and I don't think it's gone away. But in this case, it's certainly, I think the WASP is the best example of it. But I'm sorry, I've gone over time. I really appreciate this, and your questions were excellent, so thank you.
Well,
And the title of the book again is?
Valiant Women. Please write it down, August 1st.
it's already on my Christmas list.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for all your
I was
votes.
gonna
Who's
say,
got in mind?
this is my daughter, so
Oh,
she
really?
wants it.
Fantastic. You get a signed
Her
copy.
grandma's
Yeah.
gonna get a copy too.
Great.
Anyways, your MIT colleagues had already told me you were the perfect person to talk today, but there were 2 things that they didn't tell me that I think are particularly relevant for our program here. One is that you talked about how to make research fun, right? And that's part of what we really try to communicate, is that this is really fascinating, fun stuff to dig into. The other thing I think you did an excellent job of is the public communication piece of it. And that we're really interested in research, not just for research's sake, but to inform public debates and hopefully improve the quality of policy decisions. So you are exemplary.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a pleasure.